I'm James Meyer. I'm curator of late 20th century art at the National Gallery, and I'm delighted to see all of you here today on a warm June afternoon with big doings out on Pennsylvania Avenue. And I'm delighted to introduce my friend and colleague, Professor Alexander Albero, to all of you. Alex Albero is one of the most interesting scholars working in modern and contemporary art. His work is distinguished, I think, by its meticulousness and rigorousness, its deep archival focus, the fact that Professor Albero, whenever he does anything, it's incredibly carefully and meticulously researched. And also his capacity to develop large narratives of modern art. He's not the sort of scholar who focuses on a monographic focus on one artist and just focuses on that. He's capable of telling stories, narratives of modern art. And he is professor of art history at Barnard and at Columbia, where he teaches both undergraduate and graduate courses. And he's also faculty at the Whitney Independent Study Program at the Whitney Museum. He received his doctorate from Northwestern University and the University of Florida. And his first book was called Conceptual Art and the Politics of Publicity, published by MIT Press. Kind of fascinating story of the conceptual art impresario Seth Siegelaub and the artists he championed in the late 60s, Joseph Kosuth, Douglas Hubler, Lawrence Weiner, and Robert Barry. And it remains, apart from the fascinating argument he makes about the fortunes and fate of conceptual art, it remains perhaps the most cumulative study of conceptual art we have. His new book, which we're going to talk about, is called Abstraction in Reverse, the reconfigured spectator in mid-20th century Latin American art. And he also, of course, has edited many volumes which have made quite a contribution to the field of late 20th century art. They include edited volumes, Working Conditions, The Writings of Hans Haacke, Institutional Critique, an anthology of artists' writings, Art After Conceptual Art, which was sort of the study of post-conceptual art, Museum Highlights, The Writings of Andrea Fraser, Recording Conceptual Art, which were a series of interviews conducted by Patricia Norvell with famous conceptual artists in 1969, Two-Way Mirror Power, The Writings of Dan Graham, and Conceptual Art, a Critical Anthology, really the magisterial sort of volume of writings on conceptual art. He has won grants from the NEH, the Howard Foundation, and the Whitney Museum, and he's published a great deal on contemporary art as well as on historical, conceptual, and Latin American art, on artists like Andrea Fraser and Renee Green, Christian Philip Muller, John Knight, and others. So welcome, Alex, to the gallery. And apart from wanting to hear about your book and to recognize your scholarship, I wanted to recognize Latin American art, which is often not a focus here at the gallery for historical reasons we might talk about, and to bring that field into the gallery in the form of this important book that you have published.
Thanks, James, for the invitation. Thank you all for coming. I've got to say, when I got out of the train station on my way here, I saw that the streets were closed off and there were these large stages, and I thought, wow, this book is really doing well in Washington. But I'm really happy you're here. I wasn't disappointed that wasn't my book that they were celebrating, but I'm delighted that you've come out. So yes. I want to come back at the end, though, James, to this question that you asked about the historical reasons that we might talk about for why Latin American art hasn't been collected by the museum here. It could be very productive as well to take that up. I arrived at Latin American art through perspective of contemporary art, which is really what I'm a specialist in, trying to keep up on contemporary developments in art. And we can elaborate on this a bit more later, but certain transformations that took place in the art world about 30 years ago, I like to use the year 1989 loosely, with the end of the Cold War, or the end of what I call the three world order. First world, which is us, the second world, which was the communist order, and the third world, which was everybody else. With the end of that three world system, something fundamentally changed in the context of the art world. In the context of the art world that I was most familiar with, which was the contemporary art world. And this then led me to explore. I decided to explore that by looking at Latin America. Why I turned to Latin America is something we can elaborate on also. But Latin America provided me with an angle with which to explore the real, very fundamental transformations that are taking place in the art world in the last few decades. But we'll get back to that. For now, let me sum up for you what the argument is that I sketch out in the book and how I do it. And also I want to show you a few images so that we all share an image bank that we can then refer back to if we need to in the question and answer period. So in this book, I argue that during the mid-20th century, right after the Second World War, and for a couple of decades following, let's say from 1944 to 1968, I argue that in that mid-20th century period, Latin American artists reimagined the relationship of art to its public, reimagined the relationship of art to the spectator. What is the spectator's relationship to the artwork? And in the process, granted the spectator, the person, the viewer of the artwork, a much more significant role than ever before. Gave the spectator a much more prominent role in the production of the artwork than had previously been the case. I explain that in the book, I explain that these developments unfolded in the context of a complicated relationship, a complicated mediation of the particular form of abstract art that European modernists such as Piet Mondrian or Theo van Doesburg, which I show you here on the screen, or Max Bill and others, referred to as concrete art, what they called concrete art in the context of Western Europe, primarily in the Netherlands, in France, Switzerland, a few other contexts in the interwar period, captures the imagination of the post-war Latin American artists that I focus this book on. They are become obsessed with this idea of concrete art. They become especially obsessed with Piet Mondrian's work as well as Malevich's work. You should know, though, that this is an obsession, which is very interesting. It's something I don't really take up in the book, but it's a very interesting sub-area of exploration. It's an obsession that takes place without actually having seen the work. They've only seen reproductions of the work, and mostly black and white reproductions. So they'd seen Mondrian, they knew Mondrian was using primary colors, or Van Doesburg's using primary colors, but they're imagining that through black and white reproductions. With Malevich, the white on white, or the black square, transfer into photocopies or into black and white images in books much better. But still, the point is that it's an imagination of an art that exists somewhere else that is just that, namely how they imagined that the art looked like, rather than what the art actually looked like. One of the things that I discover in my research is repeatedly, more than once, when these artists go to Europe, for instance, or go to New York and see a Mondrian, just how shocked they are at the work, because it's not how they imagined the work. And even though they've already built a body of work based on that misunderstanding, that creative misunderstanding where they've imagined something and then run with that idea, and then they encounter the work and they realize, oh, well, actually you can see brush strokes in a Mondrian if you look closely. And the lines don't go all the way to the edge of the frame. They stop just before, and a number of other details. Anyways, these artists initially start with an obsession with this movement that's called concrete art in Europe. Theo van Doesburg writes one of the first manifestos in 1930 about concrete art. Mondrian writes a mini manifesto about concrete art. Max Bill becomes the representative of concrete art. But they go on. That the book goes on to show that Latin American artists, these artists that I focus on, and I focus on a small group of artists, but the understanding is that this is a much more widespread phenomenon. I selected some artists that were more accessible to discuss for a number of logistical reasons, but they're case studies for a much broader phenomenon. I show in the book that these concrete artists who, as followers of a concrete art, move on considerably from those, beyond the boundaries of concrete art, and into what comes to be called neo-concrete art or post-concrete art. And the movements that I focus on primarily in the book are neo-concrete art or post-concrete art movements. Indeed, most of the artists and so here's an idea. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. I'll come back to Oiticica in a second, but the artist will imagine a work such as Van Doesburg's or such as Piet Mondrian's as a work that moves into three dimensions. And in a way, if you're just reading Mondrian, who was quite a prolific writer, one would come to those conclusions that the work moves into the room, into the space of the room. And so what you have is artists moving these squares, these rectangles, into the space of the room, into 3 and 4 dimensions. Indeed, most of the artists whose work is central to this book, Abstraction and Reverse, created their distinctive artistic identities by pushing beyond the initial notions of concrete art that they had developed, and into developing now a much more participatory type of engagement with the artwork, as you can see here. I mean, I'm showing you this image in particular because, as you can see, the artist is in the work here. Here now you have the artist's body inside the structure of a work such as this. Of course, the work has now moved into space, into three-dimensional space, as well as into time, because the artist, the movement of the spectator's body through the work. In this case, the spectator is the artist himself, but the idea is to give you a sense of how the spectator should engage with the work. One is encouraged to enter into the context of the work itself. So they created their distinctive artistic identities precisely by rejecting the predetermined generalizations of pictorial or sculptural concretism and offering alternatives to it. And in this effort to imagine art as an integral aspect of an intellectual and sensual life that responded to their own particular concerns, they put aside the concretist notions that had initially inspired them to develop art in the direction that they did. In particular, the concretist notion that the meaning of an artwork is established prior to the reception by the spectator. In other words, this notion that the artist makes an artwork with meaning and offers the artwork that is already full of meaning to the spectator for the spectator to decode and understand. There's a shift away from that notion of spectatorial reception to the notion that meaning is produced, the meaning of the artwork is produced in relationship with the spectator. So this is one of the central shifts that I track in the book, namely the shift from the notion that an artwork has meaning that one gets from it. And, the artwork, we're talking about visual arts, but it's essentially these artists are also picking up these ideas from theater and from music, to a certain extent from film. The notion that the artwork has meaning inherent to it that the spectator deciphers, decodes, and comes to understand, a shift from that notion to the notion that the artwork and the spectator and the space around the viewing space of the room combine to produce the meaning, that the spectators take on the artwork, it concludes the meaning of the work or brings the work's meaning into fruition. So it's a concept now that assumes that meaning could be produced only in the site where the art object and the spectator meet, where the subject and the object come together. In the book, I call this site of intersection the aesthetic field. I coined this term, aesthetic field, the aesthetic field of the artwork. And I argue that by reshaping the aesthetic, and the aesthetic field, to clarify, is a field that's composed of all of the elements, an ensemble of elements that make up the artistic work itself. A field that includes not only the artist's intention, not only the art object, if there is one, not only the space in which the object is shown and the time in which the object is shown, but also information that the spectator has taken to the artwork about the art object, things that we already are presumptions about the work, and finally the spectator's subjectivity, the spectator's own personal interests in what he or she is engaging with, is looking at. All of those elements are more or less equal within the context of this field, this aesthetic field that I theorize in the context of this book, or that I theorize from reading and trying to understand the theorization that these artists had themselves constructed. So the aesthetic field of the artwork is theorized, and then I argue that by reshaping the aesthetic field to conceive of the spectator as an active and sensual being engaged in a new kind of haptic or tactile encounter, a new kind of attentiveness that involves not only the intellect, but also all of the senses. So this is the spectator that's not just a thinking spectator, but it's also a spectator that's effectively picking up information or effectively engaging with the artwork. Post-concrete Latin American artists opened the way for new modes of consciousness and new modes of experience, as well as new models of subject and object relations. There's a completely new notion of not just art experience, but also of subjectivity itself. And that's a tougher point to really clinch, but open up possibilities for different ways of conceiving of the self in this mid-20th century to late 20th century moment. I started the book with a simple question. Namely, what did it take for an artist such as Jesus Soto, a Venezuelan artist, mid-20th century, to go from producing fairly conventional paintings such as this in 1949, 1950, to pictures such as this 3 or 4 years later? A serial composition. And then just a couple of years after that, to artworks such as Spiral that literally project from the wall. I don't know if you can make that out, but this is an artwork that's coming forward now into the space of the spectator. And then by the end of that decade, a vibration series. This is very difficult to understand without looking at it, but again, you have a striated field in the background, and coming forward, dangling in front of that striated field, are wires that are moving with the breeze of the wind, so that there's movement in front of the striated black and white field, which is moving in a chance-directed manner, or breeze, the natural elements. But also, as the spectator moves across the painting, across this structure, the work also seems to oscillate. There's a visual optical dimension to the work that's very difficult to capture without moving in front of the artwork. So, and then just a few years after that, to produce the Penetrables, in which the spectator literally walks into a striated field of color. So the question essentially is, what was the logic of a trajectory such as that? Let me show you another trajectory. Elio Oiticica. Oiticica I don't have the captions on these. Oiticica is Oitica, a Brazilian artist from the mid-20th century, passed away in the late 1970s. But Oiticica also begins fairly conventionally as a painter. Already by this point here in 1959, he's painting directly on the wall. He initially starts off as a monochrome painter. Yes, it's abstract. He's a follower of Malevich in particular and the Russian avant-garde of the 1920s. But he starts painting these monochromes directly on the wall and soon moves the monochromes off of the wall, hangs them into space. The spectator is now encouraged to walk all the way around these compositions. I have several examples here. Here's one I showed you a second ago, but a recent installation of that series at the Whitney Museum, which had a large retrospective of Oiticica's work last year. So, and this is all within a few years. One of the obsessions that these artists had was with color. And as you can see, they start to experiment with the possibilities of color. One of the things that Elio Oiticica does is he starts to fill these boxes or jars or vases full of colorful elements, monochrome color, as you can see in both cases, elements that this is a series of works that he calls the bolides. The bolides are, in Portuguese, the direct translation into English would be something like the comet, fireball, but it's a fireball of color. So these are nuggets of color. Some of them are maybe the size of this box. Some are half the size, some are much larger. Some of these bolides you can open, as you can see with the one on the left. You can open, you can close. Others are to be smelled, such as you can see with the one on the right. The one on the right is a numbered bolide, which is full of coffee beans. And the idea is that the spectator inhales the coffee beans, and there's an olfactory dimension to the work in this case. But they're very vibrant monochrome objects coming from this trajectory of painting that I was just outlining, but now moving into three-dimensional space and also into these collages or assemblages of elements. Then Oiticica will move beyond that into the construction of spaces in which now the spectator is encouraged to enter and to rest, to talk to each other. The installation on the left-hand side is from a show that he had at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1970, the information show where he provided these nests. They're kind of receptacle areas where spectators were encouraged to spend some time and discuss with each other other elements about the exhibition. It was clearly something that the Museum of Modern Art took the Museum of Modern Art somewhat by surprise. They didn't know exactly how to deal with works like these in 1970 because people would literally come and spend the day just hanging out in the museum, resting, maybe even falling asleep. As you can see, they're nests where you're encouraged to recline. And these installations that he produced, this one is a piece called Tropicalia, a very famous piece from 1967, in which the spectator is asked to take one's shoes off and then walk through a space that has alternate areas that are covered with leaves, other areas that have some water in them, others with sand, through these cabins or pavilions in which, as you can see, there's plant life and there are even animal life, parrots. So when is then, and essentially, if you can imagine this, this piece. I'm sorry to do this, but how many of you saw this in New York last year when it was at the Museum of Modern Art? It was also in Chicago last year. So a few of you are aware of this. So one is not only visually looking at the artwork in this context, one's also touching the artwork, or it's touching you as you're moving through it. One is smelling the artwork in that there's a potpourri scent, there are various different scents. One is hearing the artwork in that there are parrots. It's bringing all of the senses. In this case, there was nothing to taste, but it's mobilizing the senses in the experience of spectatorship, mobilizing the senses in a way that was fairly unprecedented within the context of mid-20th century art. And that was the point. That was one of the points. Then Oiticica will move to the production of these pieces that he calls the parangole. Parangole is in P-A-R-A-N-G-O-L-E. Parangoles. And the parangole is essentially a cloak, or is essentially a piece of fabric that one puts on and moves to music. A lot of Oiticica's work was structured around a sound dimension. The music in the mid-1960s in particular, which is when the parangole are invented in 1964, and he continues to work with these through the 60s. The music at that time for Oiticica was samba music, Brazilian samba music. And so there'd be samba music playing, and one is to put on a cloak and move through the space, whatever that space would be. And these photos are obviously exterior spaces, some were interior spaces. Move through the space to the music, wearing this cloak. So the cloak brings alive the spectator's body within the context of the art experience. I'm showing you this to just give you a comparison to North American and European performance or body art of that time, in which the performative experience was one that the artist carried forward, or the artist performed in front of a spectatorial audience, in front of the viewer, whether it's Hannah Wilke on one side or Joseph Beuys on the other. It was the artist that's performing. Within the context of Oiticica's work, it's the spectator that's performing. It's the spectator, the viewer, that's to put on the cloak. The artist is not, it might be peripherally involved, but the performance element, the live element, is one that's carried out by the spectator, not by the artists themselves. Another photograph of these parangole. The last trajectory I'll show you is one, the trajectory of Ligia Clark. Ligia Clark was another Brazilian artist in this case. She starts fairly conventionally. Again, it's interesting, I say fairly conventionally, maybe less conventionally than, say, Jesus Soto, who I showed you first, started with fairly traditional figurative landscape painting. In both Oiticica and Ligia Clark's cases, the beginning is one that is an abstract art beginning, usually the monochrome. So they're already left figuration behind when they start their production in the late 40s, early 50s. But so here's some early works by Ligia Clark. These are from 1953-ish. 1954, monochrome, already, somewhat difficult to comprehend within the usual traditions of painting, we'll say. Here's another, but still one can relate this to early 20th century or in between the wars, abstract art that's produced in between the two great wars, between the First World War and the Second World War. She moves from that into works such as this. This is what she will call a bicho. A bicho basically means a creature of some sort, a kind of a critter, is how it's being translated these days. A bicho is a work that the spectator is expected to manipulate. One isn't to stare at these. The work functions through the actual mobilization of the elements, which are on hinges. I don't know if you can... It's hard to image a hinge, but what you have here, see these hinges here? So that there are multiple ways in which these objects can be unfolded or folded or moved. So one makes one's own three-dimensional sculpture through a process of manipulation. Hence, it doesn't really make sense to put them in a vitrine, for instance. This is one of the, this is some things, issues that, very important curatorial issues or collection issues or exhibition issues. Namely, what do you do with these when you then put them in a museum, when you put them in an exhibition? MoMA, a couple of years ago, had a retrospective of Lygia Clark's work, in which they built a number of replicas of these objects. So they kept the initial objects, which are now priceless, in vitrines, and they left out replicas that the spectator could engage with to understand how they work. I would argue that staring at the object was really not the work. The idea of the work with in this case, or in the case of, say, the Oiticica capes, the Parangole that I showed you, I mean, to look at the cape really is really not the point. The work is the process of engaging with the actual object. The object is one element of the work, but we'll come back to that later. Here's a Bicho, and one of the things I wanted to just emphasize is that, unlike, say, I show you on the left-hand side a work by the Swiss artist Jean Tinguely, a work that is entitled Homage to New York, that Tinguely produced in the sculpture garden of the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1959, 1960, in which the artist turns this machine on and the machine moves around. So it's a motor-driven kinetic work. Unlike that, or unlike Calder's work, which I presume Alexander Calder's work, which I presume most of you are familiar with, it's a work, to remind, that moves as well. It's a kinetic work, in other words, but in this case, the kineticism is produced by the natural elements, by breeze. It's not by a motor, but by the natural elements in the air. Unlike the motorized work of Tinguely, or unlike Calder's wind-propelled kinetic works, in the case of Lygia Clark's kinetic, we call these kinetic works because they're meant to move. In the case of Lygia Clark's kinetic works, it's a spectator who's to move them. It's a spectator who puts them into motion. Clark will move in the late 1960s into increasingly more difficult to exhibit and display artworks. These are works where the spectator is encouraged to put objects over one's head. And what's interesting is that in this case, there's a kind of binoculars. There are binoculars in some of these hoods that she's mobilized within the context of an art space, that spectators to put on the over one's head, and there's an ocular device at the eyes. There's what she called a nose bag. There was a kind of potpourri that she put inside the hoods that one would be smelling when. So one puts a hood over one's head. The vision it becomes slightly impaired or blurry, shall we say. And one can smell some substance, an organic substance of some sort. She very quickly moved on to a complete blindfold. The idea of an optical device for vision didn't work. So the hoods later in the 1960s will completely blank out vision, with the idea that if we close our eyes and experience the artwork, we're so reliant on vision for the experience of artworks that perhaps if we close our eyes, our senses will expand to encompass an even greater realm of elements within the perceptive elements within the experience of the artwork. So essentially, I could go on here. Lygia Clark, you should know, by the 1970s, essentially leaves the art world and becomes a therapist, a psychotherapist. Really believes in art therapy and the idea that art can heal trauma, or can address trauma, can help people to cope with trauma. So there's a trajectory then. If just take this last case that I showed you of Lygia Clark, where we started in the 1950s with these monochrome paintings, moving through kinetic dimension, moving through the production of these kinetic objects where the spectator's participation is crucial to making the artwork move, and then concluding by the late 60s, early 1970s with artworks that aren't barely even artworks anymore, or perhaps you can say art has now expanded to include art therapy. Art has now expanded to, has the attempt to address the human senses has expanded to the point where there's an attempt to use art to heal sensory crises, which trauma is, for instance, or other therapy, using art to attempt to heal various types of symptoms. So let me just conclude to what the central thesis or the central conceit of the book that we're talking about today is. I mean, in other words, what my central argument is. So the central argument or the central conceit of the book, in brief, is that in breaking in various ways with the core dictums of what I was calling concrete art, or what was called concrete art, this art that we talked about a few moments ago, in breaking away with the essential core of concrete art, Latin American artists in the mid-20th century reimagined the relationship of art to its public and produced artworks that challenged the prevailing notions of the interconnection between the human subject and the world, between objective reality and subjective experience. In this new conceptualization, in this new construction of the self, if you will, that the artists were attempting to put forward, art was no longer, especially this new conception of the self within the context of the artistic experience, the spectatorial experience, art was no longer considered to be entirely autonomous and internally coherent, but relationally dynamic, prompting the imaginative engagement and creativity of the spectator in the realization of the artwork and producing meaning through this very relationality. In other words, the artwork comes into being through the relationality the relationality that it enables. That this mode or this kind of aesthetic experience has in the past couple of decades become a central artistic practice once again, makes the issues that I explore in this book as topical as they are historical. So I think that, I mean, we can, if you want, I can explain more about the central conceit, but I think this sums up what the central aim of the book is. James.
Well, that was really interesting and I think quite clear.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
That was the idea.
I hope you guys found it clear too. And so I do have some questions around it that we might discuss. First of all, your first book, Conceptual Art and the Politics of Publicity. How do we get from that book to this book? So that book is about artists in North America, canonical North Americans working in the 60s, who are developing an art we call conceptual art, which generally tended to be linguistic and mental, and in which the work of art has been criticized by historians like Rosalind Krauss and others, that it resided very much in the mind of the artists, and that there was a kind of real separation, perhaps, between the work of art which kind of existed as an idea in the artist's mind and its reception by a viewer, and also an art that was radically unvisual, that was very much linguistic and cognitive art. And you've moved into a very different direction. You've moved into South American art. You've moved back in time to the 40s and 50s, to artists engaging de Stijl, Mondrian, Van Doesburg, and so on, kind of modernist art, very visual art, and how that their trajectory, as you've demonstrated very clearly, becomes one that is very much enlisting, as you say, the spectator very bodily, very perceptual, and very bodily and sensual, in which it takes the viewer, the spectator, whatever we'll call him or her, it takes that person or those people to complete the work entirely. And the artist, him or herself, puts the work out there, but you need the spectator to fully engage it. So how do we get from one project to the other?
Right. I didn't bring any slides of conceptual art, but I could sum this up. There's several dimensions there. The conceptual art, what interested me about conceptual art, what initially in the 1980s, I guess it was, prompted me to want to investigate conceptual art, was the issue of the artwork disappearing. And essentially, and I think that comes through in the book, but I certainly understand it much clearer today than I did then. Essentially, how the spectator can engage with an artwork that has no visuality. With conceptual art, quite often the artwork would become a linguistic statement, or would become an idea, become a telegraphy. Telepathy, I should say, telepathy, or become something very abstract. So how can an artwork be realized as an artwork? How can you call it a work when nothing exists other than you have the idea? So one of the things that conceptual art taught me was that art is a whole range of things. One of which is what you can see. But there's so much more that precedes the production of the work, and there's so much more that follows on the production of the work that then loops back to make that work. So to a certain extent, intellectually, the logic of conceptual art is not that far removed from the logic of this type of work. Take the parangole, the capes that the spectator wears. Spectator has to wear to bring to life, or the bichos, which the spectator moves in one's hands. The logic isn't that far away from conceptual art when you get to these artworks that require the spectator to be realized, to realize them. For instance, within the context of a conceptual artwork, you can have a work that is proposed by the artist, but this is a philosophical question. I mean, I don't want to go down this avenue too far, but does the work exist if the artist claims that there's a work, but there's nobody that's receiving it as a work? Was one of the core questions of mid 1960s, especially U.S.-based conceptual art. But one could say this is something that one tracks in the modernist tradition all the way back to Marcel Duchamp. How much does the artwork require the spectator for its existence? I mean, Duchamp will argue in the late 1950s, I believe, it was here in Washington at a conference where that the spectator is crucial to the production of the work of art. Without the spectator, you don't have the artwork. You need the spectator to bring the artwork into fruition. All of the the artist makes an element, the space makes an element, the curator makes an element, the context itself. But the actual work requires a spectator as the clinching point of realizing the artwork in question. Conceptual art had a large dimension raised many similar questions to that. I mean, I'm taking a shortcut here, talk about John Cage. There's so many other elements that enter into the conceptualization of conceptual art, but so I was in asking those questions about conceptual art. I inevitably, when encountering this work that I just showed you, inevitably started to see resonances. And you'll notice, for instance, I put together an anthology in the late 1990s with my colleague Blake Stimson, who I believe I've seen in the room here, I put together an anthology on conceptual. We put together an anthology on conceptual art, where we included Oiticica, for instance. We included some of these, Cil de Morelos, some of these artists that are now in this book were, in fact, I believe one of the first footnotes in that book is a quote from a passage that we included in a conceptual art anthology a quarter century ago or more. So 20 years ago, I guess it was. So it's not that far. They're not that far away. What's interesting, two things here. One is the bodily element, the sensual element that the work that I'm looking at in this particular book emphasizes. And that's something that, there are various ways one can parse that. It's interesting that in this case, I mean, the conventional art historical line in the 1980s, 1990s was that the body had disappeared from the production of the artwork, and another line was that the body was now reemerging. By the body, I mean an artwork that's received not just by vision, but also through some kind of physiological engagement, but also an artwork that factors in the physiological engagement of the artist, right? The body of the artist in producing the artwork. And evidence of that bodily dimension in what you're looking at, as for instance, in the work of somebody like Jackson Pollock, where just to pick an artist that we're all presumably familiar with, a work like Jackson Pollock, where we know Pollock was dripping the paint and moving his body around above the canvas, dropping paint in order to produce the work, so that when one looks at a canvas by Pollock, some people would argue that that's the indexical trace of a body that was there. That certainly wasn't the conventional way to read a Pollock in the 1960s and 70s, as you know. But it's something that once the art experience moves beyond the visual experience, just solely visual experience, one can begin to see bodily elements. And so one can begin to connect what one's looking at to bodily elements, either physiological dimensions prior to during the production of the work, or post-production by the spectator, or in the context of the room. So
this is dramatically different as late 60s American conceptual art is, as anti-visual, an idea on a page, text, maybe an idea in my mind, and the very embodied, three-dimensional, visual, corporeal experience of Latin American art that you're demonstrating in its maturity. As radically different as they are, there's a common interest in subject-object, what we might call subject-object relations, the artist's intention, what a spectator experiences, that both tendencies are concerned with that problematic of intention and experience. Is that?
Yes, I think that sums it up well. Let me add one dimension here. When I did become interested in conceptual art, I mean, one of the reasons I turned to conceptual art, just to be clear, is that I'm from Vancouver, where there weren't many art objects. So there was a lot of concepts, though. So conceptual art was a logical place to begin as a young person thinking about art. I've heard the same thing from some of my Australian friends too. I mean, the concepts which are very conceptual art was also a very strong movement.
It was a center of conceptualism. But now that you're bringing up your autobiography, did you not also spend time in South America in your childhood, or is that
Oh,
Was that
yeah.
part of your feeling engaged to explore this material?
Well, I have the languages. I don't know that I would put more of that biographical dimension into this study, be perfectly honest. I mean, that I had the languages made it very easy, made it much easier to do the kind of archival research that I needed to do. But apart from that, I don't know that one could really make. I don't think it would be fair to go further with that.
Right.
Only because it wouldn't be accurate.
Right.
But let me say one more thing about conceptual art. When you have a statement such as when you have an artist such as Lawrence Weiner, or why don't we say Barbara Kruger a few years later, even though Barbara Kruger wasn't part of the book that I wrote on conceptual art, that type of work was certainly what was informing the book that I wrote about conceptual art. Again, it was just like this book here is as much about the present. It's as much about this global development, which I talked about to you, which I mentioned to you at the very beginning today. Some of the questions of this book that I raise in this book are questions that I have about contemporary art. Only the book is not about contemporary art. I've decided to address those questions by looking at an art of a slightly previous moment. It's a very similar thing took place with me with conceptual art. I was very close friends with Mary Kelly in Vancouver, and these people were all coming through Vancouver. Barbara Kruger, and some of the questions that they were raising led me to investigate what led to the possibility of raising those questions in the first place.
Desire to go backwards to understand where we are now.
To understand where I was then.
So
yeah.
let's talk then about contemporary art and about
Okay.
the way that's shaping the necessity of doing this research into the mid-20th century Latin American art. So one of the connections you made would be the immersive tendency in the art since the 90s. But these kinds of environments which immerse the viewers into these experiences. And as you demonstrated, that was something Oiticica was trying to do back in the 70s. One could also bring up the tendency called so-called relational aesthetics in the 90s, the idea of a kind of interactive art, people interacting with one another in environments, not just sort of being a spectator and experiencing an environment, but that you're interacting with one another. An example being Ricard Cherevenija's meals, where he would serve food and you'd go to a gallery and you would all sort of interact with one another eating pad thai, and this would be the work of art. And that's called relational aesthetics. Well, you're showing us a relationality already in some of this work, people interacting with each other in Lygia Clark and Oiticica. So there are at least two narratives of contemporary art since the 90s, immersive art like this, and relational aesthetics that might seem to come out of or have precedence in the art of Latin America you're describing. Do you see the contemporary developments as, in a sense, a betrayal or a misreading? If your people are misreading de Stijl and Van Doesburg, and productively so, do you see the contemporary developments we're describing as productive misreadings of the art that you in abstraction and reverse, or a betrayal of what some of those artists were after?
That's interesting. In some cases, if we were to look at particular art, look closely at the work of particular artists, we could say that they're productive misreadings, perhaps, and probably. I mean, I'm sure we could find cases where we could make that argument. But in general, I think it's a case of, I don't think it's misreadings. I think it's something that just develops on from a particular body of work. Whether it's directly related to the work or whether it's symptomatic of a larger field of artistic production, larger trends, artistic production. These are different. That can be debated, but it's not that it's not. It is true that, say, somebody like Ligia Clark, who we were talking about earlier, had theorized what she called the relational object. And a relational experience that the spectators to have with the art object. And then this movement that you're referring to, called relational aesthetics, kind of misreads. If you want to be benevolent, you'd say it misreads Ligia Clark and takes it being the primary theorist of that movement, by a French curator by the name of
Nicolas Bourriaud.
Nicolas Bourriaud misreads the relational object that somebody like Ligia Clark, and I should have mentioned, Ligia Clark moved to Paris in 1968. One of the things that happens with a lot of these artists is that due to the dictatorships that take over in Latin America in the 1960s, in Argentina there's a dictatorship that comes into power in 1964. In Brazil, in 1968, there's a dictatorship that comes into power. Due to the dictatorships, artists move abroad. So Ligia Clark will move to Paris in 1968. She'll teach at the Sorbonne, and she has a whole life of an art life in Paris. Elio Oiticica will move to New York. He'll spend 8 years in New York. Somebody like Nicolas Bourriaud will have known about Ligia Clark's work, as he being a young French curator who, is very familiar with Ligia Clark's work, and then decides to coin this notion of relational aesthetics, interestingly, without feeling the need to cite Ligia Clark, who had constructed this notion of the relational object and the relational experience in the Spectatorial Act. So one could find cases of misreading, willful, unwillful misreading. But I think if we're talking more generally of contemporary art, I can only answer this with another question, which is why it is that, and it's a question that I ask everybody, really, because I don't have the answer. I could speculate, I suppose, but why is it that works such as this, which you see on the screen, just to give you an example, resonate so much with contemporary audiences? What is it about this immersive spectatorial experience? And I emphasize this work, I believe, I could be corrected here, but I believe this is the artwork that more people have, contemporary artwork that more people have seen than any other. I mean, it was only up for 4 months or something, but something like 4 million people went through there and stayed there, as you can see in this slide. I mean, it's just one slide of many. People would go, there were a lot of repeat visitors. It took place in London. One might say, well, it's because the sun doesn't shine in London too much, so people were going to the gallery to experience the Tate space to experience this, but to experience sun. But why is it that works like this? Or, Turrell. Turrell's become the legacy of the 60s, the minimalist legacy of the 60s. I mean, James, you're a scholar of minimalism. Why is it this legacy of the 60s that resonates so much today, and the work of somebody like Donald Judd has much, of course, perhaps you'll disagree with this, but seems to have less traction in contemporary art than something like Turrell, who in the period of the 60s and 70s, as you know, he wasn't that, I mean, people knew the work, but it didn't capture the imagination.
He was a minor
He's a minor artist, and now they are the major figures of the 60s. So what is it about our contemporary moment that champions these immersive experiences, that desires these artworks that one enters into? Now, that's an overgeneralization, okay? I'm overstating to make the point, but there's certainly been an increase of interest and even desire in this type of work in the present. Why? This is the question for another book.
I mean, for me, the works we're looking at are actually a betrayal of the tradition that you describe, and one that goes back to the Russian avant-garde in the 20s, and the desire to activate the viewer, to empower the viewer, to engage the work, to interact with others, physically, bodily, like Clark wants, or to walk around and to feel your body and your senses, as in Tropicalia, that installation by Oida Sika. To me, these works render the viewer passive and kind of bewitched by the experience of light and ambience. If you go back to the Weather Project at Tate Modern in the Turbine Hall, when I did see this, I did experience this, and most people were just lying down at the ground, on the ground, looking up to the ceiling, which of course was a reflection. And of course, what looks like a full yellow disc is actually a half disc. The top is its reflection in the ceiling. So mostly people were looking at themselves narcissistically, at their ant-like reflections way, way, way up, and hanging out, and I would say deactivated and rendered kind of numb in the pleasure of just being there. Of course, there was also the mist produced by the mist machines, creating a kind of rain-like environment in the middle of rainy London. It was fun, it was pleasurable, and it was passive, above all passive. And to me, that's the opposite of the tradition that you're summoning in your book.
Pleasure, I have no problems with pleasure. Passive, active, yes, I know what you're saying. And I only answer that with the question of, why is it? Without wanting, and I refuse to be cynical about this. And you're leading towards a cynical dimension. I ask, why is it that this resonates today? This type of work, the immersive experience. The immersive experience is even the experience that, think of all the gray box experiences where one walks into a space and there are all these live bodies moving around, and you're in the space, you're in the live art. There's a liveness dimension to this. You see, one isn't looking at a work that was made then that you're experiencing now, even though it was in this case. But in these cases, there's the feeling that the work is taking place as you're experiencing it. And there's an attraction to that today. Why that is, I don't know. I could speculate, but we could all speculate. And one thing that I do like that you mentioned earlier is that, and also, hold it, betrayal implies teleology, doesn't it? Betrayal implies moving back.
Or an intentional betrayal, and I don't see it that way. But I see it as quite different and almost opposed to the kind of art you're describing.
One of the things that you mentioned earlier was this notion of South American art, and it's interesting that the further I get into this, I'm teaching a graduate seminar this fall on Caribbean art, which I know very little about, but I'm about to know a lot more about, because I'm reading. One of the things that's very interesting is that when I called the book, I think I subtitled Latin American. A lot of that's a false term. Countries like Suriname are Dutch. There's nothing Latin about Suriname, which is in South America. There are countries like Jamaica are English. A lot of countries that by saying Latin America, one's already cutting out a number of entities, a number of subject positions, which I do in the title. I probably should.
I'm afraid I was just going from your title, Alex.
Yes.
The Greece-configured spectator in mid-20th century Latin American.
No, but you said South American, which I like because that's a lot more
Southern
accurate.
Hemisphere.
That's a lot more accurate.
Thank you very, very much for doing this with us. It's been a serious and wonderful afternoon.